Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Rebel Talk podcast. I'm your host, Zach Mareth, and as always, I'm here with your co-host, Dalen Flowers. Before we get into it, I'm going to ask you all to like and subscribe. Please leave a comment. We're here to answer any questions that you may have. Today, we're going to talk about the case for Ole Miss in the college football playoffs, kind of diving into the comparison between Ole Miss, Alabama, and South Carolina. Then we're going to talk about some potential coaching changes and the outlook of the staff, specifically on the offensive side of the ball, which we saw struggle during several points of the year. Then to wrap up, we're going to talk about the transfer portal, some of the names that Ole Miss is looking to add, some positions that need a little more depth and talent through the portal, along with some targets that have already entered from Ole Miss. So starting off here, Dalen, I want to talk about the thing that everyone's seemingly talking about, everyone's talking about on my Twitter timeline at least, this argument for Ole Miss and, arguing them against South Carolina and Alabama. And I just want to start here for the South Carolina argument. Look, Ole Miss beat them 27-3 at home. We understand that. But then you look, South Carolina, they don't have these marquee wins like Ole Miss does, beating Georgia by 3 scores. You can't lose a game by 24 points and then claim that you should be ahead of them in the playoffs. And I've seen a lot of South Carolina fans saying, well, we just beat Clemson on the road. Clemson has 0 ranked wins, Dalen. They lost to a bad Louisville team a couple weeks ago, and they got bailed out with a Miami loss, which has now given them a chance to be in the ACC championship. But Clemson, man, really not that impressive. They lost 34-3 to Georgia really early in the season, but it feels like they're hyping up a win that I wasn't really impressed with. And when you look further into the game, Clemson actually should have tied the game with a field goal if it wasn't for a deflected interception in the final seconds. So, South Carolina fans are trying to do everything they can to argue against Ole Miss and Alabama. Quite honestly, I really don't see it, Dalen. I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Man, it's a hot topic right now. And firstly, I want to say that, I can't be upset if Ole Miss does not get into the 12-team playoff, regardless of the situation. And, again, we've talked about this for the last couple of weeks. We don't know how the community thinks, and that's kind of like the weird point of this. And, it's a weird place because moving into this new format this year, Zach, we thought that creating a 12-team playoff instead of the original 14 playoff would kind of eliminate a lot of these conversations with, who deserves to get in more, the SEC bias and, the conference championship winners getting the automatic bid, whether they're better or worse than some of the teams that didn't get in. So it's a weird situation. I have been talking to people and, in the back of my mind, the South Carolina team right now is surging at a really good time. And, as much as I would kind of be irritated with them getting in over Ole Miss, I would understand it. I'll tell you who I'd be really upset about, and that's Alabama. And it's the Crimson Tide narrative. It's that they're Alabama. But the fact that they went to Norman, Oklahoma, and I get that that's a road game. And Norman, no matter the situation, is a very tough environment. But the fact that this team went to Norman, Oklahoma, and got eviscerated while we beat them says something to me. And I get it. This Alabama team, they beat LSU, but we didn't beat LSU in a row. But you got to take that into in conversation too, man. Bama goes to Baton Rouge, dominates Brian Kelly's team, but can't go to Oklahoma and beat a barely above 500 team. And again, that's another point that I want to irradiate to you. They don't just lose to Oklahoma; they get dominated. And you look at some of our wins. We don't just beat Georgia. We dominate Georgia. We didn't just beat South Carolina. We dominated South Carolina. And I hope those things are taken into the margin of what is looked at. But as the last few college football rankings have played out, I don't think that it will, unfortunately. And we just have to live with that. I think moving forward, we understand what the circumstance is. It's a kind of frustrating because, if you sit here and think maybe this 12-team playoff had been a thing for a while, last year this team would have been in that realm of hosting a playoff game. And even years prior in 2021. So it's a learning process for Ole Miss, and with chaos that could happen, who really knows, man? Like you said, some of the conference championship games, Texas, Georgia, Arizona State, and Iowa State, SMU and Clemson for the ACC championship game. I think a big one is Penn State and Oregon for the Big Ten championship game. I think, although Penn State is really higher up in the rankings, a lot of people will make a case for them as well with maybe just being a one-loss team, and them having potentially 2 losses. How does that affect them? And that's the part of sports in general that you really just you can only talk about and have your opinions, but you never know, Zach, that how much will the committee deflect for a team that only has 1 or 2 losses, but then ends up going to their conference championship game, but ends up losing. And that also depends on how they lose. Do they lose by a game-winning field goal, or do they lose by 2 possessions? So that's how, it's kind of frustrating. And you look at Boise State and UNLV, one of those 2 teams will still have a chance to get in. And that's also another topic, that I don't want to go too, berated about everything. But, I think I'm okay with it. I just think that you have to give the opportunity to each team, and it's not their fault that they're in the Mountain West, or they're in the Big 12, or blah blah blah. That they've played who's in front of them, and they've won games, and that's the goal of college football, and they've done that. And I can't be upset for those teams, but it's frustrating, man. And one team that I want to bring up to you, and I really want to have just a little bit of discussion, is Indiana. Don't get me wrong. You talked about this a few weeks ago to me on the show. Indiana's a fine football team. They have a great coaching staff. They've had a really good season. 11-1 is absolutely incredible. And I'm not taking anything away from them. But you look at their record of work this year, and you look at their depth and their players from start to finish. They're not going to compare with SMU, in my opinion, with Ohio State, with Alabama, with Arizona State, with South Carolina, Oregon, Texas, whoever gets into that 12-team playoff. And Indiana more than likely will get into that 12-team playoff. On any given day, they may beat anybody, but when I look at it from a roster perspective, when I look at it from an eye test perspective, when I look at it from a coaching staff perspective, I just don't see teams like Indiana having any chance. And it's not their fault. Again, they've played who's in front of them. They've beaten the teams that's in front of them, except for Ohio State, and they've taken care of business this year, which puts the committee in a bind. You don't really think about these things happening when you send that format from 4 to 12. You think it opens up more things, but it puts the committee in a bind, because now all the pressure in the world is on them, but they have to do technically what's politically right. And, Zach, I'll give it back to you after this. They haven't in the past with the 14 playoff format. And now I think with the 12-team playoff format, I think they will. And when I say they haven't in the past, you look at last year, a Florida State team that may have gotten eviscerated if they got in the playoffs. But you're seriously going to tell me that they didn't deserve to be in the 14 playoff based off going undefeated and winning their conference championship? You just can't. You go back to 2017, Alabama gets in that 4th spot over Ohio State and USC, who won their conference championship games, had more and more loss, yes, but they didn't get in. And, Alabama goes on, beats Clemson, beats Georgia in the national championship game, great. But since the format of this playoff committee and the 14 playoff, we have not seen the politically correct teams get in. And we've seen the teams that the committee thinks they're the best team, no matter what their resume says. And for me, I want to question, does the 12-team format change that? Because if it doesn't, then this Ole Miss football team deserves to be in the 12-team playoff. And I know a lot of people will have remarks about that and say they don't deserve it. And heck, we put ourselves in a situation that we should not be in, and this is on us. But I think at the end of the day, like the comparison I made with you last week, this is a similar situation to the 2022 Ole Miss baseball team. Did they deserve to get into postseason play? You can agree to disagree, but they got in, they got their chance, and they won the national championship game. I truly believe if this team is given a chance, then watch out, because they're still very, very hungry. And those players, I don't think they don't want the season to be ended. They got together for this year for aspirations and doing something that had never been done at Ole Miss since the 60s. So if Ole Miss is, given a chance by the committee, and again, we won't know based off just tomorrow's rankings, because we'll still have to go through the conference championship resume as well. But if the Ole Miss is given a chance, it's they're definitely going to be a team that does not want to be reckoned with, regardless if they're hosting a playoff game or not. So we'll see, man. It's gonna be a weird couple of weeks.
And we've said it, go ahead, Dylan, go ahead.
No, you're good. I'm done.
Ole Miss is one of the most talented rosters in the country. And, despite losing and slipping up a couple of these games, I think it's definitely something you have to consider. And this is kind of where it gets complicated for the committee, because you can look at the resume and, okay, Ole Miss quite literally has losses to Kentucky, one of the worst, arguably the worst SEC team by state, and a loss to Florida, who Florida's played really well. DJ Lagway, don't get me wrong, but their record doesn't show that. And the average fan who's not watching Florida and paying attention to the SEC doesn't think that. They think Florida's terrible based on their record. And so you have that side. And then you have the side of who's playing well right now. And like Dalen said, this is exactly what happened last year. Florida State won out. They won all their games. But their starting quarterback blew out his knee. It was knee or ankle, something on his leg. So therefore, they put Alabama in because Bama was playing well. They just defeated Georgia in the conference championship. But there's no doubt that Florida State did everything in their power to get that spot. And it feels like this is a common trend within the college football playoffs. And it kind of puts them in a bind because you're looking at Alabama, South Carolina, and Ole Miss. And if you're going to do it based on who's playing with the best momentum right now, I think it's clearly South Carolina. Mm-hmm. But then you look at, okay, yeah, sure, maybe they're playing the best right now, but they lost to both these teams, Dalen. So that's where it gets really conflicting. And they don't really have that marquee win like Ole Miss and Bama do over Georgia. And then you look at Ole Miss versus Alabama, and Ole Miss beat Georgia by 18 compared to Bama, who beat them by 7. They beat South Carolina by 24 on the road. Bama beat South Carolina by 3. And then the Oklahoma thing is mind-blowing because I firmly believe that Ole Miss should have been ranked above Alabama the second that they lost to Oklahoma in the fashion that they did. Oklahoma is a very, they're having a really untraditional year here. Mm-hmm. Just not a lot of talent across the board. They're having a bunch of people fired across the coaching staff. There's a lot going on in Norman, and Bama got demolished, right? We talked about this. Bama got absolutely demolished. It was terrible. It was a bad look. And I thought that was enough to move them below Ole Miss, but that didn't happen. So now, based on, how the committee has ran things after Bama just defeated an Auburn team that was coming off a win over Texas A&M, I would not be shocked if they threw Alabama in there. But I do think Ole Miss has a really good case here. And Lane Kiffin's posting about it. I think right now they have a better resume than South Carolina. And if you're gonna compare the the teams and the common opponents here, they also have a better resume than Alabama. And one of my favorite things is listening to these South Carolina fans say Ole Miss lost to Kentucky and Florida. Well, technically, you lost to a team that got beat by Kentucky and Florida by 24 at home. So the argument it's going to end up going in circles, and we're not going to find out a real result until Selection Sunday. Conference championship games have to happen. There's just a lot to take in, and it's unfortunate that we've said it all along that we're in the spot that we are right now with, Ole Miss losing to Kentucky and Florida, because at the end of the day, if you split one of those, you're easily in the playoff conversation. And going forward, I think there definitely needs to be a change as well. I don't think Boise State or Tulane or Las Vegas, whoever it may be, I don't think, they're at the proper caliber to be competing in this playoffs. I don't think Indiana should be in this playoffs. Penn State is very questionable. I know they're in the Big Ten championship. Extremely questionable program. I talked about Clemson. 0 ranked wins, lost to Louisville, got blown up by Georgia, and they have a chance to be a top 4 team if they win the ACC championship game.
Where do you put Miami? My apologies for interrupting, but where do you put Miami? Coming off another loss, and they have a lot of, again, it's weird with the arguable wins or losses, because at the end of the day, Miami has won some games that, again, they're arguable that they shouldn't have won. As you could say the same thing about Carolina, that the interception against LSU, they arguably should have won that game. But I want to ask you, where do you put Miami in front of Ole Miss?
I don't, Dalen, and I think it's difficult. Was there other loss to Georgia Tech?
Yes.
So, I mean, if you just look at that, Georgia Tech and Syracuse, no disrespect, but 2 programs that aren't playing the best football right now. And
Mhm.
if you look even further, there were games that I felt like every time I turned on the TV, Miami was constantly in a complete shootout. Their defense has been lackluster all year long. They almost dropped that game to Cal, which was very late into the night. So I don't know if many people saw that, but they should have lost the game to Cal. And then I believe it was their Virginia Tech game with that
Yep.
really questionable call at the end.
Yep.
And that's the difference between a 4-loss Miami team versus a 2-loss Miami team. I don't think they should be near any Bama, South Carolina, or Ole Miss, but we'll see. I honestly can't give you a straight answer because there's so many things to take into account here. But with the ACC and the strength of schedule over there, I don't believe they should be near those three teams. But definitely curious to hear your thoughts and just this whole situation as it is and how you think it's going to unfold here throughout the next week.
I am I will continue to say that I am just big on you play who's in front of you, and your record will show that. I don't think that there are teams that are in front of Ole Miss currently just because they have a better record that means they're better than us. But it's about the margin of the eye test for me again. I look at Miami and it's crazy because you'll hear Miami fans and you'll hear South Carolina fans chime in and they will say, Lenore Sellers wasn't 100% against Ole Miss, or Raheem Sanders played, I believe, one drive against Ole Miss. But you can make that take for any team in the country. Prince Iman Yellen doesn't play against LSU. How does that help us defensively and maybe on that fourth down drive in the fourth quarter in stopping LSU? How do we move forward with Trey Harris? I know that the game plan had looked a little one dimensional with him within the system, but how do we compel if he never gets hurt? How do we compel if I'm still adamant that Jackson Dart is not 100%? How do we compel against Florida if his ankle isn't tore up against Georgia? So you can make that argument for any team in the country. I mean, injuries are a part of the game, and it's the unfortunate part of it, but that's also the part that being a part of the media like we are, that gives us talking points. I again, this era of college football, what was so exciting for Ole Miss fans that we had developed a level of depth. And you look at every room, we had depth. So Jackson Dart goes down against Georgia. Here comes Austin Simmons, one drive, touchdown. And that's another frustrating point, that we have all this depth. And I don't want to get too far into this right now, but we see Micah Davis get a majority of the snaps against Florida in the backfield instead of Ulysses Bentley. But that's what I also would iterate. That separates this Ole Miss football team compared to other teams. I think we have depth at every aspect of this lineup, from offensive line to running back to wide receiver to quarterback to the defensive line and linebackers and the secondary. And that's something that after that Georgia game last year, we eyed to get better, and we did. And so, I don't know if it's politically correct to put a 3-loss Ole Miss team in over Miami, but I think that Ole Miss is a better football team. I think they have better depth. I think they have better coaching staff. And I think that one thing that can be looked at is, I don't know if Ole Miss has developed well enough in late game situations. And I say that, and you asked me, I think last week, just how much did I think the light fall camp and the change of the spring game changed what we did and how we played. But I like I told you, I thought that those first 4 non-conference games really affected us more than anything, and it didn't prepare us to be effective in late game situations. I mean, we get bailed out in that by Caden Priest scoring in that fourth down drive against Kentucky, and we end up missing a game time field goal. Although don't get me wrong, Pete Golding and this defense has been the star-studded defense in the country this year. They gave up a touchdown to Kyron Lacey, and LSU beats us on that late game drive. And even looking at Florida, I think that Jackson Dart throws an interception into triple coverage, comes back out the next drive, throws one again, gets another chance, and he's called a drop. He throws another one. So I wonder what the committee looks in that into situations. We have a lot of quality wins, and our margin of error in our losses are very minimal. But I will say that this Ole Miss football team has definitely struggled in the moments of pressure, and that's something that if we do get the chance to, if Ole Miss does get the chance to get into the 12-team playoff, they're going to have to clean up really well.
Without a doubt. And, I'm not going to add too much more into this, but the conference championship games this week are really going to be interesting to see, especially with the G5 team, who's going to get that spot. You wonder if Clemson beats SMU. There's a lot of holes in the 12-team playoff, and they were holes that we thought were going to be patched up by adding, this abundance of teams and compared to last year with the 14 playoff. And unfortunately just created even more arguments and more holes and more binds and all these different things that, now all these fan bases are arguing over on social media. The results are going to come out, I believe, Tuesday night. We're recording here on Monday afternoon. I believe 6 p.m. on Tuesday on ESPN. So you guys tune in. We might be live. We might be recording a video after, but we'll shoot you guys some content there. Definitely worth checking out. It's going to be really interesting to see where Ole Miss falls in between this pile of teams of Alabama, Ole Miss, and South Carolina. Moving into the next topic here, Dalen, we're going to talk about Charlie Weis Jr. and some of the offensive staff here. Florida Atlantic is searching for a head coach, and that is where Charlie Weis coached with Lane Kiffin. There's been a lot of buzz around his name. You look at what happened with the offense this year. There's people who want John Garrison getting fired because the offensive line couldn't get a push in the run game. There's people who despise Kevin Smith because Ulysses Bentley didn't touch the ball until the last game of the season. Well, I guess you could throw LSU in there. But other than that, it felt like we weren't playing our best players. So it seems like some moving around is destined to happen here, especially on the offensive side of the ball in that coaching staff for Ole Miss. I just wanted to hear, kind of what you think is going to happen, Dalen, and what you think needs to change moving forward.
It's all a tough situation, man. I just, since my time at Ole Miss in 2022, I never truly believed that Charlie Weis Jr. was able to elevate this offense where we wanted it to go. And that for some people that may seem a little crazy what I say, that this offense since 2022 has put up really good numbers, and they've put up consistently offensive numbers that compared to any team in the country. And that goes back to me, and I'm sorry if I'm being repetitive, but that goes back to me talking about the eye test, Zach. Yes, we've put up some good numbers, but you look at some of the games over this year. You look at and not even just some of the losses. I mean, you can look at some of the wins this year, the Wake Forest win and the Georgia Southern win, and heck, even the Georgia win. You just kind of sit there and situational awareness kicks in. And you're like, why was that a play call? We can look back and you reminisce about this quite often. The Alabama game last year in Tuscaloosa, coming off a time that I thought we were surging really well. Beating a Georgia Tech team, going to Tulane and winning. And we go down to Tuscaloosa and it's jet sweep after jet sweep after jet sweep after jet sweep, and I just didn't understand it. And I thought that Charlie Weis had got a little bit more of an opportunity because next week you go up against an LSU team that defense was really, really bad. And we ended up prospering moving forward. But again, like I like to argue, even in some of those wins last year, you go back and watch that Texas A&M game. I just think some of the play calls were inconsistent. And that's something that we have to take into accountability. You can look at the talent that was on that team last year, and you can say that, wow, those players may have bailed Charlie Weis out. You rewatch that A&M game and see just how many spectacular plays Trey Harris had to make because there was nothing open, because the middle of the field was not being used effectively when we have a tight end named Caden Prescorn who could do that. And so it's frustrating. But look, I brought this up to you about Charlie Weis and his relationship with Austin Simmons. I personally don't know how that will go. I don't think that even if Charlie was to leave, that Austin Simmons would go as well. But I think that's definitely, in terms of just a game plan situation, something that will needed to be talked about, and how that will work. I think that Charlie is an incredible coach, but I think just he had not had enough experience in this type of atmosphere before he got here in 2022. And I just don't think that he was mentally prepared for it yet. I think that he's done a great job. Don't get me wrong, but I think there have been a lot of flaws in what he's done. And we're sitting here now, and don't get me wrong, when I say this, I'm not putting all the problems on this year on Charlie Wise. I'm putting a good portion on them on him, but like you talk about Kevin Smith. And the entire running back situation. And you talk about John Garrison. And I also want to correlate. I think all that ends up tying back to Lane Kiffin. He's the head coach, and he at the end of the day he makes these calls. And we could talk about the injuries that the running back room has dealt with and the injuries that the offensive line has dealt with. But I just don't think that Lane has come up and taken accountability enough, in my opinion, for these situations. And even now, he's trying to fight for Ole Miss to get into the playoff. But you and you bring up this point. We don't see Ulysses Bentley get one carry against Florida. We see him have the most carries he's had the entire season, the last game against Mississippi State. And then, in the press conference, Lanes comes out and jokes about it. I did what you guys told me to do. And it's like, you're fighting for us now, but if you've been fighting for your team, I just feel like this Ole Miss team wouldn't have 3 losses currently. This conversation between Zach and I wouldn't even be happening. That, what is it the case for Ole Miss to get in? This conversation wouldn't be happening between the two of us. So Charlie Wise is a guy that's been with Lane Kiffin, understands his system for a while. And if he leaves, I'm not upset. But if he stays, I'm not entirely upset either. And that's just my personal opinion. I think that Charlie has grown as a recruiter. I think he has a lot of things that need to be worked on in terms of a coordinator. And I would expect to see a huge jump if he returns next year. And if not, then I would make that move. And you talked about John Garrison. He was a guy that was brought in with a lot of experience, man. I think a really good recruiter. And I just have not seen improvement from this offensive line this year. And I hate to call guys out, but I watched Micah Pettis have 3 holding calls in the first half against Mississippi State, and that's just unacceptable. It's unacceptable for a 4-year guy who's been in this team for a long time to continue to play like that. And Micah's played like that all season with a bunch of holding calls that, just in my opinion, for a senior needs to have cleaned up. And don't get me wrong, these guys are not perfect. They're not going to go every single game, every single part of the season with no penalties, but it was just so inconsistent for such a long time. And from that 3-game win streak, I saw it get cleaned up, but it got right back to ugliness against Mississippi State and Florida. So, John Garrison will be a guy that will be looked at. He was just brought here last year. So, within the way that college sports is right now, Zach, you see coaches get fired and leave so much now. I don't think it would change much. I think you just have to go out there, get a guy that's experienced like John Garrison was, maybe a little bit younger and a little bit more energized than maybe John Garrison is, and maybe that will affect what this team does as well. But we'll see. And I think that Lane is going to have to make some big calls on himself in terms of this offseason and how he wants to move forward, because I'm grateful to even say that this team is 9-3, but this is not what we wanted this year. And this is not what the fans wanted. This is not what donors wanted. This is not what the players wanted. This is not what the coaches wanted. And so this really has to be looked at heavily from Lane Kiffin.
And Lane is a guy who's huge on analytics and stats, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm not disregarding or taking away anything from this offense, but a lot of those huge numbers, and Lane, he talks about, we have the number 1 passing offense and explosive plays, this and that. A lot of that came from those non-conference games, which were extremely uncompetitive.
Yeah.
And those opponents simply weren't good. And that was a time when Ole Miss was blowing up on social media, with Jackson Dart having I think he had over 1,000 passing yards after the first 4 games, something crazy. Trey Harris was going berserk. I know there was that Arkansas game where Jordan Watkins and Dart and everyone went crazy. It was an awesome game. But a lot of this number 1 passing, number 1 offense in the country stuff really blossomed from starting off the season on a runway before the plane took off.
Mm-hmm.
And that's got to change, because in SEC play, it was entirely different. You can claim, these stats and these awards and these accolades, but when push comes to shove, the offense wasn't good enough in Gainesville. It wasn't good enough against Kentucky, and it definitely wasn't good enough against LSU in a game where the defense allowed you to win numerous times, and you didn't. So there needs to be a lot of reflecting. I don't know if it's Garrison. I don't know if it's Weiss. I don't know if it's Kevin Smith. But things have to change. And if you look at how a Lane Kiffin offense is operated most successfully in the past, it's with a running back that can get it done. Snoop Connor, Quinshon Judkins, these guys get several yards per carry. And there's an offensive line in front of them that is giving them a push and allowing them to maneuver through holes and find places to run. And that didn't exist this year. I do think it's going to be helpful for Kevin Smith to hopefully get rid of a guy like Henry Parrish, who he had a really strong relationship with, versus a player in Ulysses Bentley who didn't recruit here. And there was definitely some favoritism going on. You can't tell me that there was a huge talent gap between Henry Parrish and Ulysses Bentley. There wasn't. Simply put, there was not. There was a strong relationship with Smith and Parrish. I firmly believe that. And hopefully moving forward, you got Shakai Mills-Knight coming in here. You're probably going to target at least one or two starting running backs in the transfer portal. Yeah. And you hope that allows Kevin Smith to make the right decision, and a decision that was really questionable this year. But I really just want to emphasize what Dalen said. This all comes down to Lane Kiffin. So he can joke to the media about not playing Bentley and whatever the case may be, but it's on him. And, maybe it's funny for him, but it could have cost us a game that you probably should have won. If you run Bentley like you did against Mississippi State, against Kentucky or Florida, and you didn't. So ultimately we have to move forward with this, but I would not be surprised if there were changes for Weiss, Garrison, or Kevin Smith. The question is, who are you going to bring in? And are you going to take more of a leadership role as the head coach next year to go in front of these coaches to say, hey, hold on. Maybe Bentley should be playing, not because the media told me to, because he has NFL speed and a burst that no one else in the room has. And that's something I'm going to look for out of Lane for next season in terms of growing as a head coach here, Dalen. And we're talking about these changes here. I do want to touch up on the transfer portal before we wrap up. The first player for Ole Miss to enter, I believe there was a player maybe in the season, but in the actual portal era here in December, Rashad Amos hit the transfer portal. He was a guy who came in, a really experienced running back, and he didn't touch the field. Maybe he did once or twice against those non-competitive teams. May have even gotten a snap against Georgia or something crazy like that. But he's in the portal, a guy who I thought if you played could have came back and developed and been a really good running back, but that didn't happen. I'd look for maybe a few guys. I don't know if anyone notable is going to hop in the transfer portal. I will say there's a lot of buzz around Auburn trying to go recruit Suntarian Perkins. Not that I think that's going to happen. You'd hope the kid stays Golding. But it's going to be really interesting, Dalen. And we're getting around that season where things start to get really fun, especially when you're not in the playoffs and you can put all your attention in the transfer portal. I'm fully expecting Ole Miss to dominate, do some incredible things like they do every year.
Yeah, this is going to be a kind of an unconventional time for Ole Miss fans. I think that, we're used to seeing the influx of gaining guys in the transfer portal and losing a lot of those guys and losing a lot of guys in the portal at the same time. I don't see too many guys will be leaving this program in the transfer portal this year, and that's just because a majority of this team is more than likely going to be headed to the NFL draft and either getting drafted or will sign somewhere as a undrafted free agent. I think the heart of this team, like you just talked about, Suntarian Perkins will be key in bringing back, and hopefully that we can also convince Chris Paul Jr. to come back with them as well. Rashad Amos was a guy that I was excited when we got him. I mean, he was like 6'1", 6'2". I can't remember his weight, but a pretty good size running back. Limited carries this year. Again, don't know why, but I thought he was a pretty good pass blocker as well. I thought he when pressure got hot and you didn't have anything downfield and you just needed to dump it off to your running back, I thought he could do that really well, but he wasn't really given that opportunity to. 9 carries, 75 yards from this year. I'm sure he'll go somewhere where he can have the ability to be running back one or, just have a good balance of being on the field and doing what he does best. I think that, the portal for us is obviously huge. But now it's at a point where, do you want to bring in guys that have a lot of experience, or do you want to bring in guys that maybe are just really, really good, but didn't get experience at their last schools? And so I think that's going to be a big point. And the key, I think, for offensively is just how do you build around Austin Simmons, excuse me. The running back room will be the big key. You get Aiden Williams and Caden Lee back next year, and we'll see how we'll work around that. And obviously, Caleb Cunningham will hopefully will stay committed and will sign here, and you'll see how he will be used. He's a 5-star guy, so I would expect him to play next year. But I also don't know what Lane is thinking and how he will utilize some of those incoming freshmen. So we'll see how that works. And that offensive line, you will be losing a lot of guys. I think a few experienced guys will come back, but you definitely had to rework and revamp the offensive line. I'm excited about the defensive line. So Zach, that we're losing these big guys, but we have this freshman class currently here that's you may get to see play in the bowl game a little bit if the Ole Miss team doesn't make the 12-team playoff, and you kind of see the excitement that was them in terms of the high school recruiting era. And we probably will still go get a few guys out of the portal and just have depth for those guys. But I'm excited to see Cam Franklin and the collection of those guys on the defensive line, because obviously they weren't given a chance this year behind the staggered defensive line that we have this year. But those guys are some dogs, and they're ready and eager to get some playing time and showcase. It wasn't just this group of guys. It's something that Pete Golding can consistently do. So I'm excited for that. And I will say as well, really quick, man, that I think we need to go have a look at the secondary. I thought they cleaned it up against Mississippi State, but they struggled, especially early in the first half. I thought we've struggled in the passing game all season, honestly. There's some games that we cleaned it up really well, and I thought we adjusted really well against certain teams. But that pass defense has kind of been just a little bit of a head scratcher. So, look for Wes Neighbors and Pete Golding and see what they can do in that department. So, there's going to be a lot to look out for. Ole Miss fans should not be in the mindset that this team is going to be losing a lot of its talent, and next year will be a 6-6 atmosphere. That's not the case. That's not the case at all. Lane Kiffin is understanding of what the preparation is needed to be done. And it's going to be on him to also make some of those big calls to move forward with this program. So expect a lot of emergence of players coming here and us not losing a lot of players. So it should be a great mix of the portal and the high school rankings.
Yeah, man. And I want to touch on what you said there. Look at Indiana and what Curt Cignetti's done. It is his first year. He essentially brought his team with him, I believe, from JMU, and they're going to be in the college football playoffs. So, yeah, sure. We can admit Ole Miss is losing a lot of talent that we haven't had here in the past. But at the same time, you got to recognize that this is what Lane Kiffin and Pete Golding specialize in, and they're going to get players here who are going to come on the field and make an impact. No doubt. There's no doubt in my mind. One of those players I want to hit on, Kevin Concepcion from North Carolina State, recently hit the transfer portal. This is a guy who has roughly 1,300 receiving yards in 2 years. He's 5'11", 185 pounds. Look, this is one of those players who you're going to see posting on Twitter with an offer from just about every single SEC school. I can say that with confidence. But look, this is a guy who can come in and directly replace the Jordan Watkins or, a little throwback to Dayton Wade type role that, you have here in this Ole Miss offense, which we see Lane Kiffin just absolutely thrive with. We saw a shorter, flex type receiver with Elijah Moore be an absolute beast in Lane Kiffin's offense. So this is a player who I fully expect to, invest his way into the SEC. Whether he's an Ole Miss Rebel or not, I'm not sure, but definitely one to keep your eyes out for. I believe the portal opens on December 9th, I want to say, Dalen.
Yeah, you're right.
And yeah, Dylan said it. I wouldn't expect a ton of Ole Miss players, considering a lot of them are graduating or going to the NFL. But definitely, keep your eyes out for Lane to go make some noise in a similar fashion that he did last year, because it's important that this roster reloads. The schedule is very difficult. You have the same schedule but flipped, and you add Tulane and Washington State, which are really two competitive out of conference games there, which you didn't have this year. So hopefully that can better prepare them next year. It's going to make this team hopefully a little more locked in earlier in the year. And it's definitely going to make Lane and Pete and the coaching staff want to go all in and make sure this team's ready to go through the transfer portal. That's all I got, Dylan. Before we wrap it up here, is there anything else you'd like to add, buddy?
Oh, man. Ole Miss women's basketball team takes on NC State in a few days. Make sure you support them. And Chris Beard and the men's basketball team are looking locked and loaded as they move forward. I know they're coming off a tough loss to Purdue, but Chris Beard has this team ready, and they have another big game coming up here soon. So I'm excited to see just the basketball take over for this team, and maybe a basketball school. You never know. So support those Rebels. And one big shout out to the Ole Miss volleyball team. Getting their ticket punched to the NCAA tournament, going to Omaha. And Coach Bree Henry comes into this role, and last year's the head coach, and she's done a phenomenal job, and her players have bought into what she's wanted to do. So give them all their love and pray when as they go forward to Omaha in their travels, and hopefully they don't let the Rebs get hot and we can make some noise. So howdy toddy, y'all.
Yeah, man. Shout out to those teams 100%. Staying on the track of football here, National Signing Day will take place on Wednesday. There will definitely be some weird flips. Hopefully not on the Ole Miss side, but be sure to stay tuned to therebelwalk.com for all that content. We're going to be posting who signs, when they sign, some information about that player. So be sure to stay tuned. We'll shoot you back with another podcast in regards to signing day, along with the college football playoffs, which will take place tomorrow night at 6 p.m. Be sure to like and subscribe. As always, thank you for tuning in. Howdy toddy and go Rebs. Thanks, Dalen.
Howdy toddy.